The autumn wind carried the scent of snow across the Kane ranch as three siblings stood around their father's fresh grave. Samuel, the eldest at 32, removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through graying hair. Rebecca, 28 and tough as any man on the frontier, kept her eyes fixed on the wooden cross they'd hammered into the hard earth. Caleb, the youngest at 25, shifted restlessly, his hand never straying far from his Colt. "Pa always said this land would keep the family together," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Land don't feed families when there's no money to work it," came a familiar voice from behind them. They turned to see their older brother Everett approaching on horseback, his marshal's badge catching the last light of day. At 35, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much violence. His custom Winchester rifle rested in its saddle holster, the silver wire inlay of a serpent eating its own tail glinting like a warning. "Everett," Samuel nodded curtly, "thought you might not come. He was my father too." Everett dismounted and approached the grave, but the siblings didn't move to make room for him. The tension was thick as morning fog. "So what's it to be?" Everett asked, getting straight to business. "We selling this place or not?" "We've been over this," Rebecca said, her jaw set. "Pa left the ranch to all four of us equal. 3 of us want to keep it. 3 of you want to go broke on it," Everett shot back. "There's silver in these mountains and mining claims are selling for good money. We could take our shares and start fresh." "Start fresh somewhere else, you mean?" Caleb spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the edge of youth and anger. "Some of us call this place home, Everett. And some of us call it a trap." Everett's voice hardened. "I've got responsibilities. A marshal's pay don't cover everything, and Martha's expecting our second child. I need my share of Pa's estate." Samuel stepped forward, his own hand moving instinctively toward his gun. You need. What about what Pa needed? What about what he wanted?" "Pa's dead," Everett said bluntly, "and the dead don't get votes." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Rebecca stepped between her brothers before someone drew iron. "We'll buy you out," she said. "Give us time to work the ranch, make some money, and we'll pay you fair value for your share." Everett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? You 3 can barely afford ammunition for your bounty hunting, let alone enough to buy out a quarter of this spread." "We do all right," Caleb said defensively. "You do all right catching 2-bit rustlers and claim jumpers, but that won't buy you a quarter section of prime Colorado Territory land." Everett remounted his horse. "I'm filing papers with the territorial court next week. We're selling whether you like it or not." "The hell we are," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. Everett looked down at his 3 siblings, Samuel with his quiet intensity, Rebecca with her stubborn pride, and young Caleb with his hot temper. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or sorrow. "I'm sorry it's come to this," he said finally. "But I got my own family to think about now." "Then you're no family of mine," Samuel replied. Everett's face went hard as stone. "Fine, have it your way." He wheeled his horse around and rode off into the gathering dusk, leaving his siblings standing beside their father's grave. "He means it," Rebecca said quietly. "He'll take us to court." "Let him," Caleb spat. "We got rights too." But Samuel was staring after their brother's retreating figure, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "Maybe there's another way." September 12, 1877. Marshal Everett Vance Kane rode the mountain trail with practiced caution, his prisoners shackled to the saddle horn. Jake Morrison, known as Mad Dog for his vicious temper, had been surprisingly quiet during the 2-day journey from Colorado Springs back to Denver. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," Morrison said as they rounded a bend that opened onto a small clearing. "The Black Canyon Gang ain't gonna let you bring me in." "The Black Canyon Gang is welcome to try," Everett replied, though his hand moved closer to his custom Winchester. He'd been tracking the notorious outlaw gang for months, and Morrison was the first member he'd managed to capture alive. "They know this trail," Morrison continued. "Know you got to come through Devil's Canyon to get to Denver. Perfect place for an ambush, if you ask me." Everett was about to reply when the first shot rang out. The bullet took his horse in the chest, and the animal went down hard, pinning Everett's leg beneath its weight. Morrison's horse reared and bolted, carrying the shackled prisoner 20 yards before he managed to leap clear, his chains snapping on impact with the rocky ground. 3 men emerged from the rocks above the trail, rifles trained on the trapped marshal. Everett recognized the leader, Silas Kane, the Black Canyon Gang's cold-blooded boss. Kane was a tall man with dead eyes and a reputation for enjoying his work too much. "Well, well," Kane drawled, "if it ain't the famous Marshal Vance and his fancy rifle." Everett struggled to free his leg from beneath his dying horse, but the animal's weight had him pinned solid. His Winchester lay just out of reach, the serpent inlay mocking him in the afternoon sun. "Let Morrison go and we can discuss terms," Everett said, though he knew it was hopeless. Kane laughed. "Terms? Marshal? You ain't in any position to discuss anything." He gestured to his men. "Boys, relieve the good Marshal of his burden." The next few minutes were brutal. They shot Morrison first, couldn't have loose ends, Kane explained almost apologetically. Then they turned their attention to Everett. "That's a mighty fine rifle you got there, Marshal," Kane said, picking up the Winchester and examining the silver inlay. "Custom work like this probably cost more than most folks see in a year." "It was my father's," Everett said through gritted teeth, still trying to work his leg free. "Was," Kane agreed. "Now it's mine." The last thing Marshal Everett Vance Kane saw was the barrel of his own rifle pointing down at him. 3 days later, Samuel Kane was shoeing a horse outside the family barn when a rider approached at full gallop. He recognized Deputy Tom Crawford, one of the few lawmen who'd worked regularly with their bounty hunting operation. "Samuel," Crawford called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Where's Rebecca and Caleb?"
"Inside," Samuel said, setting down his hammer. Something in Crawford's voice made his stomach clench. "What's wrong, Tom?" Rebecca and Caleb emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. Crawford removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Never a good sign, Dot. I got bad news," he said. "It's about Everett." The world seemed to stop. Samuel felt the words before Crawford spoke them, felt them settle in his chest like lead bullets. "He's dead. Ambushed on the Denver Trail 3 days back. Cavalry patrol found him and his prisoner both shot to pieces." Rebecca made a sound like a wounded animal. Caleb's face went white, then red with sudden fury. "Who?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Black Canyon Gang, looks like. Everett was transporting Jake Morrison, Mad Dog Morrison, back for trial. Gang must have set up an ambush to free him, then killed them both to cover their tracks. Morrison's dead too." Caleb asked. Crawford nodded. "Shot in the back while trying to run, looks like. These boys don't leave witnesses." Samuel walked over to the water trough and splashed cold water on his face, trying to think past the rage and grief. When he looked up, his siblings were watching him with expressions he'd never seen before. "Did they get his rifle?" Rebecca asked quietly. Crawford's face darkened. "That fancy Winchester of his? Gone. Along with his badge, his money, everything of value. Animals didn't even leave him his dignity." The 3 siblings exchanged glances. They'd fought with Everett, said things that couldn't be taken back. But he was still their blood. "What's the Territorial Marshal's office gonna do about it?" Samuel asked. "What they always do," Crawford said bitterly. "Form a posse, ride around the mountains for a few weeks, find nothing, then declare the Black Canyon Gang probably moved on to New Mexico or California. Case closed. Like hell, Caleb snarled. Crawford looked at the young man with understanding. I know how you feel, boy, but the Black Canyon Gang ain't your usual rustlers and claim jumpers. These are professional killers. They've been hitting travelers and law enforcement all across the territory for 2 years. Nobody's been able to touch them. Nobody's been family, Rebecca said quietly. That night, the three siblings sat around their kitchen table planning. Rebecca had spread out every map of Colorado territory they owned, while Samuel cleaned his rifle and Caleb sharpened his skinning knife. We know they're still in the territory, Samuel said. Morrison was their man, which means they've got a hideout somewhere they felt safe bringing him to. Question is where, Rebecca replied, running her finger along the mountain trails. Could be anywhere in 100 square miles of rough country. Not anywhere, Caleb corrected. Somewhere with water, shelter, and multiple escape routes. Somewhere they can watch the approaches but get out fast if they need to. Samuel looked at his youngest brother with new respect. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about nothing else. Caleb's voice was cold as winter morning. These bastards killed our brother, took his rifle like some kind of trophy. I want them found, we all do, Rebecca said. But we got to be smart about it. The Black Canyon Gang's been staying one step ahead of every lawman in the territory. What makes us think we can do better? Samuel smiled grimly. Because we ain't lawmen. We don't have to follow rules or worry about jurisdiction or building cases for court. We just have to find them. And then? Rebecca asked. Then we give them the same justice they gave Everett. Over the next 2 weeks, the siblings prepared for the hunt. They cached supplies at remote locations throughout the mountains, studied every reported sighting of the Black Canyon Gang, and quietly gathered information from their network of contacts in the outlaw community. Their regular bounty hunting work came to a complete stop. Deputies who'd worked with them for years suddenly found the Kane siblings unavailable for jobs. Wanted posters piled up on Samuel's desk, ignored. People are starting to talk, Rebecca warned. Crawford asked me yesterday if we were getting out of the business. Let them talk, Samuel replied. We got more important work now. The break came from an unexpected source. Martha Vance, Everett's widow, visited the ranch on a crisp October morning. She was showing her pregnancy now, and the sight of her made all three siblings uncomfortable with guilt and grief. I know you all had your differences with Everett, she said without preamble. But he loved you, all of you. Even when he was angry, he never stopped loving his family. Martha, Samuel began, but she held up her hand. I'm not here for condolences, she said firmly. I'm here because of something Everett told me a few weeks before he died. He said he'd been tracking the Black Canyon Gang for months, that he thought he knew where they might be holed up. The siblings exchanged glances. Where? Rebecca asked. Deadwood Canyon, about 30 miles northeast of here. There's an old mining camp up there, abandoned since '74 when the silver played out. Everett said it would be perfect for outlaws, remote, defendable, but close enough to the main trails for quick raids. Why didn't he check it out? Caleb asked. Martha's face hardened. Because he was waiting for backup. He'd requested additional marshals from Denver, but they never came. The territorial marshal's office said they couldn't spare the men, so he went alone. Samuel concluded. He went alone. Martha stood up, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Find them, she said simply. Find them and make sure they never hurt another family the way they hurt ours. October 15th, 1877. The three siblings rode out before dawn, their horses' breath steaming in the cold mountain air. Each carried enough supplies for 2 weeks, though they hoped it wouldn't take that long. Samuel led the way, following game trails and old mining roads toward Deadwood Canyon. They rode in silence for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts. The aspen trees were turning gold, creating a canopy of color that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But beauty was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. On the second day, they found their first sign, the remains of a campfire beside a creek, maybe a week old. Someone had been careful to scatter the ashes and eliminate obvious traces, but Rebecca's sharp eyes caught the telltale signs. Professional job, she said, kneeling beside the cold fire ring. Whoever did this knows how to cover their tracks. But not perfectly, Samuel observed, pointing to a spot where someone had scraped food scraps into the bushes. And they had horses, 4, maybe 5. They followed the faint trail for another day, moving carefully through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. Deadwood Canyon opened before them like a wound in the mountains, a narrow gorge with steep walls and limited access. The abandoned mining camp sat at the canyon's end, a collection of rotting buildings and rusted equipment slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. But smoke was rising from one of the cabins. There, Caleb whispered, pointing. They spent the rest of the day watching from concealment, counting men and noting patterns. The Black Canyon gang had indeed made the mining camp their base, 5 men total, including Silas Kane. They'd chosen well. The canyon had only 2 ways in or out, and both could be easily defended. But as Samuel studied the layout, he began to see possibilities. The mine shaft, he told his siblings as they made camp a mile away. It comes out on the other side of the ridge. If we can get in through there. It's been flooded for 3 years, Rebecca pointed out. Place is probably full of bad air and cave-ins. Maybe. Or maybe it's our way to get close without being seen. That night they made their final preparations. Samuel wrote a letter to Martha Vance, explaining what they'd found and what they intended to do. If things went wrong, at least someone would know the truth. You sure about this? Caleb asked as they checked their weapons one last time. Samuel looked at his youngest brother, seeing their father's determination in the young man's eyes. Everett was family, he said simply. Family takes care of family. October 18th, 1877, 3 a.m. The mine shaft was worse than they'd feared. 3 years of flooding had left the tunnels partially collapsed and filled with stagnant water that came up to their knees. The air was thick and foul, and more than once they had to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for a man. But Samuel had been right about one thing. The old tunnel did come out behind the mining camp, emerging from a concealed opening among the rocks above the main cabin. They emerged like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, water dripping from their clothes and faces blackened with mine dust. Below them, the Black Canyon gang slept in their stolen beds, confident in their security. Remember, Samuel whispered. We want Kane alive long enough to find out where Everett's rifle is. They moved like the professional hunters they were, surrounding the main cabin and cutting off escape routes. Samuel kicked in the front door just as the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls. Nobody move. He roared, his rifle trained on the nearest outlaw. The cabin erupted into violence. Silas Kane rolled out of his bunk and came up with a pistol, but Rebecca was faster. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. 2 other gang members tried to reach their weapons, but found themselves staring down the barrels of Kane rifles. The 4th man made it to the back door, but ran straight into Caleb's waiting blade. When the shooting stopped, 3 outlaws were dead and Kane was on the floor, bleeding and cursing. Where's our brother's rifle? Samuel demanded, pressing his gun barrel against Kane's forehead. Go to hell, Kane snarled. Caleb stepped forward, his skinning knife still bloody. Wrong answer. It took 20 minutes of persuasion, but Kane finally broke. The Winchester was in the main cabin, along with Everett's badge and the money from his last 3 jobs. They'd been using the rifle for hunting, treating it like any other piece of equipment. Samuel found the weapon propped against the cabin wall, the silver serpent inlaid, dulled with neglect and misuse. His hands shook as he picked it up. This belonged to our father, he told Kane. Everett carried it because it reminded him of home. You killed him for it. He was just another lawman, Kane replied, trying to maintain his defiance despite the bullet hole in his shoulder. He was our brother. Samuel worked the rifle's action, chambering around. The mechanical sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. You got 2 choices, he told Kane. You can die quick and clean like a man, or you can die slow and messy, like the animal you are. Kane looked into Samuel's eyes and saw his own death reflected there. Quick and clean, he whispered. Samuel nodded and raised the rifle. This is for Everett. The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. 3 hours later, the siblings sat outside the mining camp as smoke rose from the burning buildings. They'd found not just Everett's belongings, but evidence of dozens of other crimes, watches, jewelry, money, and personal effects taken from victims across the territory. We should report this to the territorial marshal, Rebecca said without much conviction. Should, Samuel agreed. But then we'd have to explain how we found it, how we knew where to look. Questions we might not want to answer. Caleb was sitting apart from his siblings, staring at something in his hands. When Samuel looked closer, he saw it was their brother's badge, tarnished and dented but still readable. He was a good marshal, Caleb said quietly. Whatever else happened between us, he was good at his job. He was, Samuel agreed, and he deserved better than dying alone on some mountain trail. They buried the outlaws in unmarked graves and scattered the ashes of the burned buildings. By evening, there was little evidence that the Black Canyon Gang had ever used Deadwood Canyon as their base. The ride home took 2 days. They traveled slowly, each lost in their own thoughts. The terrible anger that had driven them for weeks was gone, replaced by a hollow feeling that might have been satisfaction or might have been emptiness. On the evening of October 20th, they rode back onto the Kane Ranch as the first snow of winter began to fall. The place looked different, somehow smaller maybe, or just less important than it had seemed before. What now? Rebecca asked as they unsaddled their horses. Samuel hefted Everett's rifle, feeling its familiar weight. Now we get back to living. The ranch. We'll make it work. Find a way to buy out Everett's share from Martha, keep the land in the family like Pa wanted. And if we can't, Samuel smiled grimly, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But somehow I don't think money's going to be our biggest problem anymore. He was right. Word of the Black Canyon Gang's disappearance spread quickly through the outlaw community, though no one seemed to know exactly what had happened to them. The Kane siblings' reputation as bounty hunters grew overnight, not just for their skills, but for their absolute ruthlessness when crossed. Nobody wanted to find out what happened to people who hurt the Kane family. November 27th, 1877. Albert the Raven Finch arrived at the Kane Ranch on a crisp winter morning, his photographic equipment packed carefully in a specially built wagon. The eccentric photographer had traveled from Denver after receiving a letter from Samuel requesting his services. Most folks want pictures taken in town, Finch observed as he set up his camera outside the log cabin. At the photography studio where the light's controlled and the backgrounds are proper. We ain't most folks, Samuel replied. Finch studied the three siblings as they prepared for the photograph. There was something different about them, a hardness that hadn't been there when he'd photographed them with other bounty hunters 2 years earlier. They carried themselves like soldiers returning from a war. Might I ask the occasion? Finch inquired as he adjusted his camera's focus. Family portrait, Rebecca said simply. But Finch's experienced eye saw more than that. These weren't people celebrating, they were people remembering. The rifles they held weren't props but tools of their trade, and the expressions on their faces spoke of recent violence and older sorrows. Most interesting was the dog sitting beside Samuel, a bloodhound with intelligent eyes and graying muzzle. The animal was clearly old, but it carried itself with dignity. Fine-looking hound, Finch commented. Yours. He was our brother, Samuel replied. Goes by Tracker. Finch nodded and made a note in his log. He always recorded such details. They helped him remember the stories behind his photographs, and stories were what made his work meaningful. The bloodhound had appeared at the ranch 3 days after their return from Deadwood Canyon, thin and travel-worn but unmistakably Everett's dog. How Tracker had found them they couldn't say, but the animal had settled in as if he'd always belonged there, sleeping by the fireplace and following Samuel around the ranch. Loyal animals, bloodhounds, Finch observed as he prepared his photographic plates. Known for their devotion to their masters. Known for their long memories, too, Caleb added quietly. As Finch worked, he found himself studying the siblings more closely. Samuel held a rifle that was clearly expensive, custom metalwork, professional craftsmanship, the kind of weapon that cost more than most men earned in a year. But it wasn't new. The stock showed years of careful use and maintenance. That's a beautiful Winchester, Finch commented. Family piece? You could say that, Samuel replied. When the photograph was finally taken, Finch felt an unusual satisfaction. He'd captured something important here, not just 3 people, but a story of loyalty and loss and justice served in the shadows. I'll have the finished photograph ready in Denver within the week, he told them as he packed his equipment. Send it to us here, Samuel said, handing him payment plus a generous tip. And Mr. Finch? This session never happened. Finch tipped his hat. What session would that be? December 1877. The photograph arrived a week later, along with a note from Albert Finch expressing his satisfaction with how it had turned out. Samuel propped it against the mantelpiece and stepped back to study it. There they were, 3 siblings with their father's rifle and their brother's dog, captured forever in silver and light. They looked older than their years, marked by experiences that couldn't be shared with outsiders. But they also looked at peace, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "We look like we've been through hell," Rebecca observed. "We have," Samuel replied, "but we came through it together." Martha Vance visited the ranch that same week, bringing her young son and carrying her unborn child. She took one look at the photograph and understood immediately what it represented. "You found them," she said simply. "We found them," Samuel confirmed. She nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a thick envelope. Everett's will was read last week. He left his share of the ranch to his children, with the provision that his siblings could buy it back at fair market value. Samuel started to speak, but Martha held up her hand. "There's more. Everett had been saving money for years: marshal's pay, rewards for fugitives captured, his share of your bounty hunting profits. He left it all to his family." She handed Samuel the envelope. All of his family. Inside was a bank draft for $8,000, more than enough to buy out Everett's share of the ranch and modernize their operation. He knew, Martha continued. Somehow he knew that in the end blood would tell, that you'd all find your way back to being family. "Why?" Rebecca asked. "After everything that was said, because he was counting on it," Martha replied. "Everett told me once that the Kane family had never backed down from a fight, and they'd never abandoned their own. He was betting his life on that being true." Samuel looked at the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. Not just 3 siblings mourning their brother, but 4 siblings reunited in death as they'd never been able to manage in life. Spring 1878, the Kane Ranch prospered that year. With Everett's money, they expanded the cattle operation, improved the buildings, and hired additional hands. Their bounty hunting work resumed, but more selectively. They could afford to be choosy about their jobs now. More importantly, their reputation had changed. Word had spread through the criminal community that the Black Canyon Gang had simply vanished, and while no one could prove the Kane siblings were responsible, everyone suspected. Other outlaws gave them a wide berth, and the ones who didn't learned quickly that some families were too dangerous to cross. Samuel kept Everett's rifle, but he also kept it clean and properly maintained. On quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch and oil the Silver Serpent inlay, thinking about their father and brother and the strange ways that justice sometimes worked. Tracker grew older but remained a constant presence around the ranch. The bloodhound seemed to understand that his job was done, his master had been avenged, and his loyalty had found a new home. In June, Martha Vance gave birth to a daughter she named Hope. When she brought the baby to visit the ranch, Tracker approached cautiously and sniffed the child's blanket, then settled down beside her with a contented sigh. "He remembers," Martha said softly. "He knows she's family. Family takes care of family," Samuel agreed, using the words that had become the ranch's unofficial motto. That autumn, Albert Finch returned to take another photograph, this time of the expanded Kane family, including Martha, her children, and several ranch hands who'd become part of their extended clan. But the original photograph remained in its place of honor above the fireplace, a reminder of justice served and debts paid. Years later, when visitors asked about the 3 stern-faced people in the old photograph, the Kane siblings would smile and change the subject. Some stories were meant to be preserved in silver and memory, not shared with strangers. But among themselves, on quiet winter evenings when the snow was falling and the wind was howling through the mountains, they would sometimes take down the photograph and remember the autumn when they'd learned that family bonds could survive even death, and that justice, when it finally came, was worth any price. The bloodhound would always stir when they brought out the photograph, as if he too remembered those dark days in Deadwood Canyon. He'd lived long enough to see his master's family reunited and his killer brought to account. For a faithful dog, that was enough. In the years that followed, the Kane Ranch became legendary throughout Colorado Territory, not just for its success, but for the unshakable loyalty of its owners. The 3 siblings never married, dedicating themselves to the land their father had loved and the family that had cost them so much to preserve. When the territory became a state in 1876, they were among its most respected citizens. Samuel served briefly as a county sheriff, Rebecca became the first woman elected to the local school board, and Caleb established a successful horse breeding operation. But they never forgot the lessons learned in that terrible autumn of 1877. Family came first always. Justice might be delayed, but it would never be denied. And some debts could only be paid in blood. The photograph remained above the fireplace until the day Samuel died in 1923 at the age of 78. His last words were reportedly about his brother Everett and the rifle that had brought their family back together. That rifle, along with the photograph, now rests in the Colorado State Historical Museum, where visitors can read the story of the Kane family and the price they paid for justice. But the full story, the story of that bloody autumn and then the reckoning in Deadwood Canyon, remains locked in silver and memory, preserved forever in the faces of three siblings who refused to let their brother's murder go unavenged. Some legends are born in courtrooms and history books. Others are born in the shadows, where justice wears no badge and answers to no law but blood. The photograph tells the truth for those who know how to read it. Three people who had lost everything and found it again in the most dangerous place of all, in the bonds that make a family, and the courage to defend those bonds against any enemy. In the end, that was enough.